nice to have you joining us here, and we thought we'd go through a few questions. You and I've had a chance to talk about some of these things previously. And maybe I'll just start a little bit historically. Obviously, PayPal was incredibly successful. In fact, my wife, who's sitting right over there, can attest to that. I think she was one of the early ones to join PayPal. But it's probably, for most of us, a little bit incongruous how you go from PayPal to creating businesses involved in space, involved in solar, involved in electric vehicles. How did you kind of conceive of that move? What made you kind of make the jump from PayPal to doing these things in energy and space?
Well, when I was in college, I thought about what would most affect the future of the world, and there were 5 areas that I thought would most affect the future. One of them was the internet, and then the other 5 were space exploration, particularly making life multiplanetary, sustainable energy, genetic engineering, and artificial intelligence. And at least the first 3 I thought would be unequivocally good. But the second, artificial intelligence and genetic engineering, is much more of a difficult subject. Could go wrong.
could have some interesting results, right? Just curious, though, the parallels that you see between the work at SpaceX, the work at Tesla, Solar City. I mean, I think we can see the parallels, certainly in this room, with Solar City and Tesla. But the SpaceX piece seems, again, kind of separate from that. Do you see parallels? Are there lessons either on the engineering side or in the manufacturing process that actually work across all 3 of those companies?
Well, I suppose there's just general, creating a company and sort of getting a group of people to work together. I think those things are common across all the companies. And certainly developing new technology, there's some commonality there. But I think one has to abstract things to a fairly high layer before you actually get commonality between space, cars, and solar energy. There's not that much commonality, to be honest. With SpaceX and Tesla, there's certainly in using lightweight materials and advanced design techniques. You've got to make cars light, and you also want to make making rockets light is critical to their success, and then making cars lighter so that the non-battery pack portion of the car is minimized is also important in order to get good range. And then certainly on the manufacturing side, there's a lot to be learned there.
Are you using a lot of the same materials in both the SpaceX effort and the Tesla effort?
Similar materials. The Model S is the only all-aluminum car made in North America. So it's an aluminum body, aluminum chassis. Mm-hmm. And it's harder to work with aluminum than it is to work with steel, which is what most cars are made of. So on the rocket side, about 2/3 of the rocket airframe is actually made from aluminum lithium, which is an advanced aluminum alloy. It's too expensive for use in cars. Mm-hmm. And then the other 1/3 is made from carbon fiber. Yeah. So, and the Roadster, the first car that we made, was an aluminum body with aluminum chassis with a carbon fiber body.
I think there is a common culture of just engineering approach and engineering excellence, and maybe one anecdote is, we always know when we're really screwing something up. When Elon sends, the Tesla engineering team down to see how SpaceX does it, And likewise, we may have, we know we're actually on the right track when the SpaceX engineers show up and kind of come to check out how we're doing something and, try and see if they can replicate that. So I think that as an engineering culture of excellence, I think there is some deep commonality between SpaceX and Tesla.
That's one of the areas I wanted to explore a little bit. Many of us here are involved in companies that have been around for a long time. Our company has been in existence for almost 130 years. There are many in the room like that. And inevitably, there's a culture that kind of grows up around a company that has been serving its communities and its customers for a very, very long time. You have a culture. You're able to kind of create a culture. From the standpoint of what you believe really makes a successful company, how much time do you spend on this thing, this culture thing? How would you describe the culture that you have in the companies at SpaceX and Tesla and so on?
Well, I don't think we spend a lot of time sort of consciously on creating a particular culture, but I think the culture comes from the actions and the way that I guess you interact with people and conduct meetings. I think now that the companies are fairly big, Tesla's about 12,000 people, SpaceX is about just over 4,000 people. I've given some thought that to actually writing something up because the amount of direct interaction I have with people is a lot more limited. I do skip level meetings, so it's like I meet with my report and their direct reports.
It's good to hear some of these familiar words.
Okay.
Skip level meetings.
I think that's a good
We do
idea.
those too.
Yeah, I think it's a good idea. I mean, generally, for a company, when it's very small, productivity grows quickly because of specialization of labor. And then productivity per person declines due to communication issues as the company gets bigger. Mm-hmm. As you have more and more layers through which communication has to flow, that necessarily imparts errors. Like every time information flows from one person to another, even with the best of intentions, you have information loss. So it's just broken telephone, basically. Yeah. So to the degree that you can alleviate that by doing things like skip level meetings, I think it's a good idea. But I think now the companies are getting bigger, and even with skip level meetings, there's just a huge number of people I don't see at all. I think some kind of written document that people can refer to, sort of like the rules of the company and how things should work. I think
would that be a values statement? Here's the values of the company.
The problem with certainly values, but I mean, if the value statements are just sort of fairly obvious mom and apple pie stuff, then it's difficult to say, well, how should this be a set of operating instructions for the company? So it's got to be something that people that's quite actionable. Like, okay, these are rules that are different from how we might otherwise do things. Like the rules need to particularly capture counterintuitive things. Mm-hmm. If something's like fairly obvious, or then I guess people will probably do that. But the counterintuitive stuff is less obvious. And one thing we have at the companies is we try to minimize the size of meetings. I think it's actually important to minimize the size of meetings.
So what would be a normal size? How many people would you typically have in one of your meetings?
Normal meeting would be 4 to 6.
I need some of my people to take note. That's why I was asking that.
I mean, but the basic rule for the meetings is that somebody should, unless somebody's getting enormous value from the information they're receiving, or they're contributing to the meeting itself, they should not be there. And we also have a rule that if somebody's in a meeting and finds that this meeting is not helping them in a meaningful way, and they are not contributing to the meeting, they should just leave.
Just get up and pack.
Just get up and walk out.
All right. Yeah. And would that be, in your culture, would that be rude to do that? Or?
No, that's expected.
That's
it's rude
expected.
to stay.
We may be able to go a little further.
So that, yeah, my meetings can be the biggest time sink ever. But this had to cause some consternation when we had, we've had some sort of, we've had some collaboration programs with other companies where we would have 6 people in the meeting and they would have, I don't know, 30 people in the meeting.
Now we're starting to sound like some of the meetings I'm used to.
Yeah, it's a frequent problem, and they really don't like it when people get up and walk out either.
Yeah. So let me get down to brass tacks. JB, how many meetings have you walked out on where Elon has been running the meeting? No, don't go there.
Question.
I'm just having some fun with you.
It has happened.
It has occasionally happened. I mean, he's serious. It's actually expected. It's a negative thing if you're just sitting there and not contributing and kind of on your phone or on your laptop in the corner of the meeting. There's so many groups like that, and it's just no one's engaged and it's not productive.
So do you have a no iPhone, BlackBerry policy when people are in meetings? Or do you let people try to multitask across the electronic communications while also engaging, participating actively in a meeting? I'm going to get off this topic shortly. I'm kind of curious.
We don't have a hardcore, people often have laptops and phones in the meeting. But if what they're mostly doing in the meeting is working on their laptop or phone, then they can do that at their desk.
Right.
So it's like
they should get up and pack.
Yeah. I mean, if there's a sort of brief sort of lull in the meeting and they can they can do something, that's fine. It's okay. But if they're doing it too much, then there obviously shouldn't be the meeting in the first place.
Well, I want to just cover a couple of other pieces. Kind of struck me, we're sitting here giving the Edison Award to people, and of course, the name of your company, your car company, is Tesla, and everyone in this room knows well the history of the kind of battle for the space between Edison and Tesla in their day. Kind of interestingly to me, a lot of the technologies you're working on really kind of use DC as opposed to AC, yet the name kind of harkens back more to the inventor of the AC, or bringing that to. But I want to get into this, kind of using that as a backdrop. Probably for a lot of people in our industry, they hear this word disruption, transformative business plans, disruptive technologies. And I think kind of at the core of that is often a sense of the word displacement. Disruption means displacement. And you and I chatted a little bit about this before. I think you have some interesting views on how some of these new technologies and the companies that are involved in these new technologies really operate with the existing utility infrastructure, the existing grid, existing electric infrastructure, and how the companies are they in a war with each other? Are they fighting for territory? Is there room to collaborate? Is there room to work together to achieve some goals, for instance, in electric transportation? So again, I know you have a lot of thoughts on this. We've talked about it before. You and I have. I think the audience would be interested in hearing your views on this disruption and how these companies are going to behave with each other.
Sure. Well, let's see. I think I'm not actually a fan of disruption for its own sake. I think that if there's a need for something to be disrupted, and it's important to the future of the world, then sure, then we should disrupt it. But I don't think we should just disrupt things unless that disruption is going to result in something fundamentally better for for society. So a lot of people think I'm a fan of disruption, but I'm not really a fan of disruption. I'm just a fan of things being better. So how would just pursue that a little bit? Things being better. Sure.
You've talked to me before about your views on sustainability, and that would presumably be one of those getting better, is seeing a more sustainable energy future.
Yeah, I mean, there's no question that I think everyone, if you say, do you want the future to be sustainable in the long term, I think anyone who's not insane will say yes. I mean, that's like, clearly we all want the future to be sustainable. So in order to be sustainable, we have to have sustainable means of production and consumption of energy in such a way that it doesn't make the world really bad. So electric cars are obviously, in our view, the way to address the CO2 consumption of automobiles, and then there needs to be a sustainable means of generating that energy, of which solar is one, and then nuclear, hydrothermal, hydro, there wind. There are many forms of energy generation that one can see sustaining into the very long term. But
You say you do not see sustaining into the long term?
it's I think all the things I just mentioned will be there in the long term.
I see.
Yeah. And I think the primary means of energy generation is going to be solar. It will at least be a plurality and probably at least a slight majority in the long term. I mean, as it is, the Earth is almost entirely solar powered when you consider the fact that we would be a frozen ice ball at 3 degrees Kelvin if not for the sun. And it would be very dark. And there'd be no precipitation, and almost the entire ecosystem is solar powered. So what we're talking about is taking quite a small amount of energy in the grand scheme of things from the sun and turning that into electricity. Mm-hmm. But it's crazy to think that every square kilometer receives a gigawatt of solar energy. I mean, it's 1 square kilometer, gigawatt. It's crazy. In fact, for a lot of nuclear power stations, and I'm not against nuclear, unless it's sort of in a natural disaster zone, like question mark.
Maybe we'll get you working on some of our storage of nuclear waste issue.
Yeah, I know this is a challenging item, but if you take a nuclear power station and the whole clear area mm-hmm. that's around it, yeah. There ends up being quite a big clear area around most nuclear power stations, and it ends up being quite a bit of land. And if you calculate, well, if you carpeted that land with solar panels, mm-hmm. Which would generate more, the nuclear power station or the solar panels? And usually it's the solar panels. Now of course, you could always amp up the nuclear power station, but just taking the way things currently are, that's just sort of an interesting data point. Just to give you a sense of how much energy is hitting the Earth from the sun.
Are you saying crazy. For the same footprint?
Yeah. Because the clear area is usually quite significant for a nuclear power plant.
And is that with existing solar technologies? Or?
Yeah, just because it's 1 gigawatt per square kilometer. Mm-hmm. So if you've got let's say 3 to 5 kilometer radius of clear area, where you don't have where you can't have mm-hmm. significant construction, and you say, what's that area? How much energy would you be able to generate? And it's typically more than the nuclear power plant. That's not an argument against nuclear. It's just to give you a sense of just how much solar hits the ground. It's crazy. But where I think that the future is going for utilities, I think is actually quite positive in the long term, because if you say we want to have a sustainable energy future, then ultimately, that means in the long term we want to not be burning a whole lot of hydrocarbons. So, right now utilities provide about, I think it's roughly 1/3 of the energy consumed by civilization. or electric utilities to be precise. And then another third is heating, and another third is transportation, roughly. So if ultimately all of that has to go to electric, that means a tripling of the energy consumption by electric. So the long term is very positive for electric power generation. And only a portion of that will be distributed. Probably a little bit less than a third, I would imagine.
That meaning the other 2/3 would be what we refer to as central station
Exactly.
or utility scale form of generation.
Exactly. So if my rough guess would be that there is more than a doubling of utility level demand in the long term, utility level electricity demand.
Yeah, electric vehicles are probably the most immediate example of
Yes.
that, and it's part of why we invest so much time in building relationships with the electric utility industry, is because there's this natural alliance. There's a natural partnership. All the energy to charge the vehicles comes from the utilities for the most part, and we see them growing very quickly, and that's becoming one of the biggest load growth mechanisms for certain utility regions. So that 1/3 of the energy is already underway in its shift over to utilities, which is pretty cool.
Yeah. So maybe just to pursue that a little bit, if you were to ask this group to do something to really help advance the wide-scale acceptance of electric transportation, particularly vehicles, let's focus on passenger vehicles for a minute, what would you want this group to do? How would this industry really help catapult the use of electric transportation?
Well, I think helping streamline and make the charging operation for customers, especially in their homes, just as easy as possible is something that utilities overall can help with. I mean, it's something where it feels to us that utilities should want this to happen and should be embracing this as a really exciting part of the future. It's one of the main load growths that's still out there. So anything that can be done to make that, all the way from permitting to installation to to usage and metering, if that's appropriate, as easy as possible and as transparent for the end customer, that would be great.
So I think actually the first conversation I had with you, Elon, was on the telephone around the fast chargers that you were looking to install, several of them in our service territory. Maybe you could talk a little bit, the two of you, talk a little bit about that kind of fast charger network, how that, again, integrates with the utility industry, and what's your kind of broader vision for that charger network? Why is that important, an important part of your product offering?
Sure. Yeah, it's true, actually. The reason I called you up was to find out if there's any way to expedite the permit for a couple of our Supercharger stations.
By the way, he wasn't quite as calm as he is now when he asked that question, but it was good. It was all good. I think we got him done for you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, there were a couple of key Supercharger stations that we were trying to get set up before the Christmas holidays last year. So thanks for helping make that happen.
It was our pleasure. It was actually some of the team out here were the ones that were really responsible for doing that.
Yeah, so in order for people to drive electric cars, they really need to be able to drive long distances. And that means they've got to be able to stop and recharge quickly. And so you can basically say, okay, well, what's the convenient ratio of drive to stop time? And that ratio, that inflection point is right around 6 to 1, maybe somewhere between 6 to 1 and 8 to 1. In that, if you think of yourself taking a long trip, let's say it's a 6-hour drive somewhere, if you start at 9 a.m., then around noon you'd want to stop, hit the restroom, grab a bite to eat, maybe grab a coffee, and be on your way. And that stop, it would typically take somebody at least 20 to 30 minutes. So if the charge time is about equal to that, then you haven't really suffered any inconvenience. And I know this sort of some people think like, well, I'm only going to stop for like 10 minutes on a 6-hour drive. I'm like, okay, that's rare. You're really torturing yourself.
Well, it's even more fun when you have kids in the car.
Right, exactly. I mean, you do a stop with kids, it's like takes a long time to get back on the road. But that sort of 20 to 30 minute stop time is really important. As soon as that stop time becomes like an hour or more than an hour, then it becomes very inconvenient. Then people are sort of sitting there in the car waiting to go. And then particularly if you've got kids in that situation, it's not good.
Yeah, that won't work.
They're like, why are we going?
So when are we going to get there? When are we going? Yeah.
Why are we sitting in the car, not moving? So it's critical to get that stop time down around, ideally around 20 minutes, but 30 minutes is probably okay. And so the superchargers are designed to do just that, is recharge about 3 hours of driving in 20 to 30 minutes. In some cases, closer to 20 minutes at this point. We started off with 90 kilowatt superchargers, then went to 120, now we're at 135, and we're actually looking at having even more capable superchargers in the future.
So JB, does that cause particular issues on the engineering side, being able to charge something that fast with that much power?
Well, it definitely is a challenge. It's almost surprisingly, plain and simple when you're at the supercharge station, but that's leveraging and maximizing all the different systems, cooling, batteries, cable capacities. But we designed that from the beginning. And when we first architected the Model S, we had to take a bit of a leap and plan for supercharging even before the infrastructure existed, just because we thought that was going to be an important part of the car. And I think it really turned out well. And people use it very, very frequently, more than even we expected. So it's enabling cross-country drives and up and down the different coasts in California, on the East Coast as well.
Yeah, and in fact, I should say what I think this audience would actually know what we're talking about. You know the difference between like DC and AC and stuff like that. Like most people, I mean, if you talk to sort of an average person, DC, AC is not clear what those are.
That's a rock group.
Yeah, AC/DC is a rock group, exactly. So there are chargers built into the car which take AC and can take up to, depending upon whether it's if it's a sort of a 3-phase input, can take up to about 22 kilowatts. And then for higher power, going up to 135 kilowatts and maybe more, we have a high voltage DC bypass that goes direct to the pack, and then the supercharger communicates with the car, kind of hand in glove. What is like basically a real fast tango, maybe a better analogy. So since the supercharger and the car are able to sort of effectively communicate, and we know at a detailed level how the chemistry is working, we're able to charge the car very effectively by exactly matching the charging algorithm to the chemistry and the current state of the battery pack.
Maybe one point to throw in too. I know there's often some fear on the utility side of looking at fast charging, because it just seems like we always want to go faster and faster and faster, and people imagine these multi-megawatt loads, but the total energy going into the fleet of cars doesn't change all that much. So on average, you don't see really very, very huge loads. You just see cars coming and going more quickly on an individual basis. Mm-hmm. And also, still, the majority of charging is happening at people's houses overnight. Yep. That's something that also I think gets missed a little bit. Supercharging is awesome, and it delivers this incredibly important goal to take long distance trips. But we see something like 90% of people charging happily overnight. Yeah,
it's actually more like that 90 to 95% of all energy is not from superchargers. Right. Superchargers are only a little over sort of 5 to 8% of the energy. And I think an important thing to consider also is range is incredibly important for many reasons.
You have pretty specific goals on the range you want to try to achieve with your vehicles, right?
Yeah. Well, when the number of charges you need is sort of inversely proportionate to the range. to the square of the range, I should say. So you can imagine that if you had a car that had a range of 2,500 miles, then you would not need any superchargers. Just like go wherever.
Might be a little hard to get it down the road.
Yes, it'll be like you sitting on top of a giant battery bag. But if you had a 2,500 mile, if you had a car that could go basically across the continent, then you would not need any chargers. Now, as you reduce the range and you make the range, let's say, 30 miles, now you need an enormous number of chargers. So you can imagine like the range growing like a circle, and so as that range grows, you really need not that many chargers. In fact, we're now at the point where you can travel virtually anywhere in the United States on the Tesla Supercharger network, and almost anywhere in Northwest Europe, and soon anywhere in Europe, and soon anywhere in China. So because of the long range of the Model S, you really don't need that many supercharging stations to be able to enable long distance travel. That's extremely important, because if people sort of have this idea of like, do you need chargers at the supermarket? Like, do you need chargers like at the convenience store? You definitely don't. Not if you have decent range in the car. So that, I think we'll just see superchargers used for long distance, and then all the other charging will be at the same place that people typically charge their phone, which will be their home primarily and their office.
We've actually done quite a bit of work on this in Southern California, our service territory. And just to share some of those pieces, our estimate is about 80% of the charging will take place at the home, which when we kind of embarked on this some years ago, that was definitely our hope, is that the vast majority would take place late at night while everybody's sleeping, perfect off-peak balancing. I think we've seen a little bit of a shift in that, but the other part that we keep hearing from customers is they're still concerned about running out of juice. And so this kind of almost, it's part real and part psychological, but trying to have visible charging apparatus available in places that they frequent, where they're going to stay there for some bit of time, seems to be important from an overall acceptance standpoint. Long term, I'm not sure about that, but short term, in the immediate term, trying to get people more comfortable with the idea they're not going to run out of juice, trying to have the charging apparatus a bit more ubiquitous, as well as also seeing a lot more electric vehicles. When the combination comes together, we think we'll have a lot more acceptance. But I know you all have done a tremendous amount of work and thought, given this a lot of thought. What do you think is really going to be the critical success factors for getting electric transportation to be truly widely adopted?
I think it's really just having an affordable electric car that's great, that has long range, and looks good, has good performance, good electronics. But do
you have specific goals on those things? So what would that price point need to be? What would that range need to be?
I mean, ultimately there needs to be a full range of cars and trucks, and in the full range of affordability. So with Tesla, we started off with the sports car, which is on the expensive side. Then we have the sedan, which is less expensive, still fairly expensive, but not quite as bad as the sports car. And then we're working on our third generation car, which is a smaller car that's meant to be an affordable long-range electric car, which is the Model 3, and that's due out in late 2017. So that's going to be about $35,000 and have at least a 200-mile useful range. Hopefully a fair bit more than that.
Yeah, and maybe it's obvious, but I think in having the ability to make a car that has good range, long range, over 200 miles, and also an affordable cost, one of the more critical pieces is how do we get that energy storage to have an acceptable cost. So that's part of why we spend so much of our attention and time, trying to invent and improve ways to make energy storage more cost efficient.
So why don't we go ahead on into that? As I remember from our last conversation, JB, you're very much involved in getting the Gigafactory done and operating. And is that kind of critical to this quest for affordable storage? Is it on the production side, or do you see it more on ultimately the technology side? How do those pieces work?
Well, they're definitely combined, but I think what we're going to see the most in the next few years is a massive increase in scale of battery manufacturing. You know, for the last decade, or maybe even 2 decades, it's been driven by consumer electronics, cell phones, laptops, those sort of devices. And I think maybe this year, maybe next, we'll see this crossover where the majority of battery demand is driven by utility and also vehicle applications. So the growth curve on those type of markets is so much faster. It's orders of magnitude more demand that we'll see from vehicles and the grid than what people used in their cell phones and laptop computers. So that is going to drive down the prices much faster than I think most people expect. And the Gigafactory is the first.
On the order of what? What would you guess?
On the price reduction?
Yeah.
Well, I think most of the targets that we see from the likes of DOE or EIA, I think are definitely very much on the conservative side. And you can sort of do the math on what a battery would have to cost, for a vehicle that can travel 200 to 250 miles and still cost $35,000. But I think we would be disappointed if battery costs weren't in the $100 range by the end of the decade, somewhere in this ballpark.
That's quite
$100 per kilowatt hour.
Yes, sorry.
I was thinking he was saying watt. Good. But in terms of the whole storage piece, seems like just a few weeks ago I was with you and you did your unveiling of the Powerwall and the Powerpack, which was really quite an event. Incredible buzz generated around that, starting 2 or 3 weeks before the actual unveiling, and then quite a bit afterwards. Tell us a little bit about how you see the Powerwall in particular, how you see that kind of fitting into the electric infrastructure, how that integrates with perhaps Teslas or solar panels, or how do you see that part?
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, I'll talk a little bit about the Powerwall and then a bit more about the Powerpack. The Powerwall is sort of a small kind of wall-mounted battery pack, and its function is going to be, or its application is going to be quite different, say, in different parts of the world. And it really depends on the nature of electricity provision in various parts of the world, and whether there's a rate arbitrage opportunity or not. So I'll talk about the U.S. market. And there's a lot of confusion among journalists because they'll conflate the use of the battery pack as kind of a UPS, as like a backup power system, with use of the battery pack or the Powerwall as a daily cycling system. But in the U.S., since there's not really much of an opportunity for a time of day rate arbitrage, or to sort of buffer power during the day, we think most customers in the U.S. are going to be using it as kind of a UPS, as a backup power. So that essentially protects them in case that there's a big storm or some kind of natural disaster, or whatever the case may be where there's an occasional power outage. And then depending upon how many Powerwalls they install and the size of their house, that will give them backup power for a certain number of hours. So that's basically a backup power function. And so that's not really an economic argument. It's more of a security argument. What value is there in how many people see value in having an uninterruptible power supply? But even if that's only a few percent of households in the U.S., that's still a pretty huge market because it's sort of millions of Powerwalls just in the U.S.
I think most of the stuff I saw around it is okay, $3,500 for the Powerwall, but are there other things that you have to do to also really make it function that way or function in some other manners. So there's more around what's the actual net cost associated with it.
Yeah, I'm gonna. Unfortunately, I have a annual. Well, not unfortunately, but I have a shareholders meeting in a couple of days.
You get to do those too, huh?
Yeah, later this week for Tesla. So I'm just planning to talk about it then.
Well, here's your chance to preview it.
So I'm going to talk about it, I think, at the Tesla shareholders meeting, because I think there's a fair bit of confusion in the media, and I think, unfortunately, some things that were also said by Solar City that were not correct.
Oh.
Yeah.
You don't have any control over those guys?
Well, we had a conversation.
Oh, geez. We want to. That's actually what we really want to hear about.
But I think that we'll fix some of those items there, and I can't say that that just the distribution of the Powerwall will be prioritized on who is able to provide this to the end user at the lowest cost, assuming a minimum quality standard. So for those that meet the quality standard, because there's excess demand, we want to make sure that the end user still captures the benefit, and because it would be possible to sell the Powerwall for quite a bit more than what we distribute it for.
Okay. Let's talk about the Powerpack, because I think that, as
yeah,
you said,
exactly.
that's something that's kind of interesting from a utility standpoint.
Absolutely.
As well.
So I should also say, like the Powerwall, I mean, we expect in terms of of stationary storage that probably 80, if not 90%, of all the stationary storage we sell will be the Powerpack, not the Powerwall. So the Powerwall gets a lot of attention because it's kind of a consumer-oriented thing.
It looks pretty good too.
Yeah, it looks nice. Absolutely.
Who did the design on that?
It's at Franz von Holzhausen in our design studio.
Oh.
So.
Maybe I took you off your subject,
but yeah. So the Powerpack, which is a almost infinitely scalable stationary storage system that's capable of doing gigawatt hour of storage if you want. That's what we expect to be the mainstay of the stationary storage activity, and there's a huge amount of potential for that, because even before one gets to renewable power generation, if you simply say as a utility, well, what for any given day, what's the difference between my peak and trough of energy provision? And if let's say that's a 2-to-1 ratio, in principle, you could take a whole bunch of your production, like the most expensive production, basically the most difficult plants, and you could actually potentially shut down some of the more difficult plants or curtail their use, and use stationary storage with something like a Powerpack, and fundamentally improve the efficiency of the grid.
And maybe just to throw in a little piece here, we've been doing a fair amount of demonstration and experimentation with storage for several years. We've got a really large 32 megawatt hour storage facility in the transmission system, so that's at one of the big bulk power substations. And we've been doing a lot on the distribution side. Obviously, as a utility, we're not able to go beyond the meter, so at least what we think we've uncovered up to this point, still very early, a lot of work has to be done, but for some of our circuits, the actual probably best place to locate would be at the neighborhood level, so even what I'll call sub-circuit level. In other cases, having storage at the distribution system substation, but again, at the distribution side, probably as opposed to the bulk power side. I don't want to make these sound like grand conclusions because there's a lot more work to be done, but I think that's potentially one of those areas where there could be an interesting nexus between what you all are doing and what the utility industry is doing.
Yeah, I think we share some of those conclusions actually, and we've seen the best real economic value most often in the distribution system, and in particular, utilities tend to have the best understanding, of course, of that system. And we've had partnerships with several people that have a very detailed analysis of their own distribution system. And they can tell exactly where the constraints are and what the costs are to upgrade those constraints, whether it's a transformer, a substation, or a line between two different neighborhoods or something. And I think increasingly, we're going to see batteries as the most cost-efficient option to actually increase the capability of the distribution system. And that doesn't even take into account the resiliency benefit. That's sort of a side benefit in most cases, but cheaper than building a new transformer or pulling new wires, to increase capacity to a region.
It's kind of tricky if you put it on the bulk power side. At least what we found is most of that effort would be to relieve congestion, somehow deal with that element. In so doing, you kind of trash your own market. I think that's probably, as much as anything else, why we've seen the better application so far to be on the distribution side. At Southern California Edison, we have a Irvine Smart Grid project, and that's really where we've done a lot of this type of work. What would you, again, for the purposes of this audience, what would you like to see the utilities do with your company or with other companies on storage? What would be the link?
I guess what we'd like to do is engage in a dialogue to say, okay, how can what Tesla's doing be most useful to the utility industry? How do we build a stationary storage technology that helps to take things to a whole new level? And I think at least sort of version 1 of the Powerpack, I think we've got something that I think is pretty exciting. And we actually have been working with utilities for about 2 years, even before the announcement. So it was people weren't aware of that, but we had actually been working for about 2 years. But I think one of the exciting potential things with the Powerpack is that it's quite compact. So because it's lithium ion, it doesn't take up much space. You can get 100 kilowatt hours of storage in something that's smaller than the size of a refrigerator, and you can get megawatt hour very easily just by putting them in a row. Mm-hmm. And that means you could take an existing substation without even having to get any new land or anything, and actually put these in an existing substation. And so you can be right there at the distribution side, and you can have these systems then cross-communicate between substations and adjust the basically load level, so I think there's some really exciting applications there, and I think a lot of times with some of the storage technologies that are very bulky and big and require a lot of land, and you've got to go figure out, okay, how do you put a new substation in some suburban neighborhood? It's a real pain in the neck. They don't like it. But if you can just use the existing infrastructure, but get really dense with the battery storage, I think there's some super exciting applications, and it just gets really easy to do.
I think our industry for decades has seen storage as, it's often referred to as the holy grail. The trick has been the cost. So comparing it with other options for making the system safe, reliable, and affordable, it just hasn't typically been there. So I think that's of course the promise. That's the hope that we can really drive these costs down, either through some of the production methods or through technology, so that it becomes really competitive with the other sources. I wanted to move into an area that I know you're quite aware of it. You and I both live in Los Angeles. The Los Angeles Times has been pretty active here lately, going on about the subsidies that have been garnered by primarily Solar City and Tesla, I think much lesser extent at SpaceX, and kind of put a pretty edgy article out there about the subsidies that you all have enjoyed. A few days later, you came out with a spirited defense of that, and I think it'd be good to give you an opportunity. Just how do you see that debate? How do you see that issue? How are you all responding to that?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't even call what the LA Times wrote journalism, honestly. That was terrible.
But why do you think it was terrible?
Sure. Well, the way you can tell if something sort of a shill article that was fed to them or real journalism is that if it's a shill article, they will establish certain fallacies. So they will, for example, sum up everything that's occurred in history and everything that will occur in the future and make it sound like it is happening today.
You see, you have a similar experience with the press.
Right. Then they will also include things that were, say, a loan that was paid back with interest as somehow a subsidy that's happening today, some historical thing. Or for example, for the Gigafactory, where they'll say 1.3 billion. What they'll forget to mention is that's over 20 years, and that we've yet to experience the benefit of any of that yet today. It will start to be beneficial when the Gigafactory is in production in the next few years, but it's, again, over 20 years. And when you actually net that out and say, well, what is the impact per car, because that is intended to support 500,000 cars per year, plus 15 gigawatt hours of stationary storage, it actually ends up being about $150 per car in the future.
Yeah.
That has not yet been received today. And to even mention SpaceX in this regard is an outrage, because our competitors, Boeing and Lockheed, receive a $1.2 billion subsidy per year. SpaceX, they mentioned, is getting a
20 million or something.
Yeah, so like $15 million or something in the future from Texas for establishing a launch site on the south coast of Texas. So actually, SpaceX has received zero.
I think they were mostly focused on the Solar City and Tesla.
Yeah, they just threw SpaceX in there for good measure. Just to be assholes, basically.
Technical term.
But that, like, the SpaceX subsidy would be like, I mean, this is a launch site that would last for like 30 years, and it's like $15 million subsidy, so it's like $500,000 per year in the future over 30 years, effectively, compared to $1.2 billion per year every year for our primary competitor. So that's another way you can tell it's not journalism, is if they place no context. So if a competitor is getting 1,000 times more, literally 1,000 times more, and they don't mention that, then it's not journalism.
Well, I think it was at least good to see. I mean, you came out and responded to those things. They put that actually above the fold, as well as the article that they originally came out with.
Disgrace to the LA Times. Disgrace.
Well, at least you got equal time on that part.
Yeah.
You know, I think another part that's all of us deal with in one way or another, and certainly in California we're seeing a lot more of this. Henry Perea, the AB 327 bill, was kind of getting at this issue of, he said it roughly like, I don't want, my constituents in the poor areas of the Central Valley having to fund the rich folks in Malibu, I think he used was the city, getting solar panels on their roof. So this kind of issue of the rich poor, Tesla's an expensive car. That's for more the rich people, not for the average people. Solar panels more for the rich people, or people at least can get good credit ratings, not so much for the poor. How do you kind of view that issue, and what do we do to try to make these things more available to all strata of the economy?
Yeah, well, I mean, the fundamental issue with incentives or subsidies when it comes to renewable power is that we've been unwilling as a country to establish a tax on carbon. If you could establish a tax on carbon, then no incentives or subsidies would be necessary because the market system would work as it should. I'm a big believer in the market system. The market system is just basically the collective will of the people. That's all. So if you can, as long as there's not something that's causing an error in the pricing system, as there is because of the unpriced externality, which is the CO2 capacity of the oceans and atmosphere, the market system works very well. But since we've thus far been unwilling to place a tax on carbon, and simply price it correctly is really what it would amount to. There are all these indirect mechanisms which are they're clunky, and they don't always have the best outcome, but they end up trying to subsidize sustainable energy instead of putting the right price on unsustainable energy. And occasionally that will result in something unfair happening because of just the inherent clunkiness of the system. Mm-hmm. But then you have to say, well, what is the greater good? Whether somebody is rich or poor, they still want a sustainable future. Right? And in fact, the CO2 and rising temperatures will affect the poorest people in the world the worst. So I think if we're unwilling to accept a carbon tax, which we will at some point, it will happen at some point, but then we have to accept some clunkiness between now and then with the incentives and subsidies.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, I think the media also tends to portray it that Tesla or even Solar City to some extent only want to sell to wealthy customers, but that's not at all the case. Sure. It's where we had to start in order to make the technology acceptable in the market at the price that people would be willing to pay. And internally we work incredibly hard every chance we can to reduce the cost. Most of our effort is focused on how do we reduce cost so that we can grow volume and reach a broader customer base. And that we just keep recurring on that same loop. But there was no agenda or desire to sell to wealthy customers only.
Yeah, exactly. On the car side, I think this is an important point to emphasize. And we've said it multiple times, but people keep forgetting it. In order to get to an affordable electric car, the only way that we could see to do that was to make version 1, version 1 of the technology is always going to be expensive and it's low volume. Or whenever you have version 1 of a technology, it's expensive and then it's low volume, that makes it even more expensive. In order for any new technology to be affordable to mass market, you've got to go through several technology iterations and you've got to scale up and achieve economies of scale. And that's true for everything. Right. So you look at the cell phones that people use every day, sure, incredibly ubiquitous. They started off being these very expensive phones that didn't last very long. Remember Wall Street 1, where the guy's walking around with like a shoebox on his next to his head, basically.
I think I remember those. And
they cost thousands of dollars. Didn't last very long. Had very little power. But now you can get a phone that's basically they'll just give you a phone with your plan basically at this point. So phones are very cheap and incredibly powerful. But they had to go through many iterations of the technology, and they had to get to big economies of scale in order for them to be affordable. It's the same is true with electric cars. And we're actually trying to accelerate the progress with electric cars and do it only in 3 generations, whereas gasoline cars have had hundreds of generations to get to a compelling mass market product.
So we're getting close to the end of our time here. I wanted to just explore one last piece. So you've done really an amazing range of businesses, from Zip2 to PayPal to SpaceX, Tesla, Solar City. Do you have desires to go to some other areas, start some other businesses that are interesting to you?
Well, as I said in the beginning, it's like the things that I think that are important to solve are sustainable energy and making life multiplanetary. I mean, just like if you say, what are the things that are important for civilization as we know it to have a good future? Those are the things that are of interest to me. So it's not creating companies or being disruptive. It's just sort of making sure we are on a path to a good future. So I think I'll be focused on sustainable energy and on space for a long time, try to make sure that bad things don't happen on the AI front.
Good. Well, we're going to be adjourning here at this point, and I wanted to thank you both. Thank you both for coming here to New Orleans. I hope you're going to do something fun while you're here. Also want to thank you for your work in the area of electric transportation, storage, certainly things that are very important to our industry and, as you said, very important to mankind. So appreciate that dedication and that effort. Please help me thank J.B. Straubel and Elon Musk.